Welcome back as we continue our introduction to GML, the scripting language that's built into GameMaker. As we continue our lesson, we're going to talk first about the use of loops in GameMaker. Loops are very useful when you want to have some given action occur in your game repeatedly, a specific number or a set number of times. Now, it's possible to do that using the drag and drop system, but it is often quicker and more efficient and more powerful to do it by writing a script. So I'm going to show you an example. We've got one here showing a script where we will ask the player to say how many balls they want to draw out on the screen, and then we will, using a loop, draw however many balls the player wants. So I've already created the script here, and let me walk through it quickly. So we've got a local variable that's going to hold on to a number, and then we're going to set that num variable equal to a number, an integer, that the player provides to the script. And this getInteger function works the same way as the getString function, where a message box will appear in the center of the game window with a question as a string and then a default response, in this case 10. And then it will take in whatever the player types in on their keyboard, and then it will create here in this repeat loop, it will create that many balls. So for example, if the player went with the default number, and then we would use the repeat function 10 times, use the instance create function to randomly position on screen the x and y coordinates of object ball, which is this ball right here. On our object ball that's already in the file that you can download, it has a create function which is going to set the speed and direction. So it's going to set the direction to random, any direction on screen, and it will set the speed to default to 4 and then add up to 3 additional numbers onto the speed of the ball. And also, when the ball is created, it's going to grab the ball sprite and then select at random one of its 9 sub-images. And when the ball goes outside the screen, we'll just use the built-in wrap action for this one rather than using the script that we wrote earlier. Alright, so again, the idea of this repeat loop is that whatever number is here will get repeated 9 times this statement inside the loop. Alright, in order to make all that happen, we need to come back to our hello room. And we've got our object controller already sitting in the room, and remember it had a press space event that we included last time, and we just need to make sure that now when we press the space bar, we're going to execute that new script we just created, the ball script. And we need to make sure that we have a copy of our controller object out in the room, which we do. We've got one, and that's all we need is just one. We also have some shapes left over from the previous assignment. Alright, so let's see what happens when we make use of a repeat loop inside our game. So remember from our previous part of our lesson, we have our shapes that are floating around on the screen and wrapping appropriately. If I press the space bar, then I get a message box that says how many balls to show. I'll choose 3, and I say OK, and then presto, 3 balls are created on the screen. They have randomly selected the direction, and they're moving at a not quite random speed, but within a given range of speeds. Right. I press it again, and then I'll get 10. And I'm not deleting the previous instances, so each time I hit the space bar and add more balls. It's just adding to the ones that are already there till we get a whole bunch of them up on the screen. So using this, you can start to see the power of a repeat loop. Doing very little, we can produce lots of things occurring out on the screen. Now, repeat loops are just one of multiple types of loops in GML that you can use to have something happen multiple set number of times inside your game. Another type of loop is called a while loop. And the idea of a while loop is that while some expression is true, whatever is inside the loop will continue to happen. You have to be a little careful with while loops, because if you set them up incorrectly so that the expression is always true, it never changes, then you will be stuck in an infinite loop with the actions that are inside that loop occurring forever. So when you use a while loop, you need to make sure that there is a way within that loop, within the actions that are being performed, for the expression to be changed from true to false. So let me give you an example of what that can look like. So we're going to create another new script. This is going to be a circle script. And you can see what we've got here. I'm going to type this one out for us. Again, we're going to have a local variable. We're going to call it I. And we'll set I equal to 0. Then we'll have our while loop. So here's the beginning of our while loop. Here's our expression when while I is less than 40. Well, we initially have initialized it to be 0. And so somewhere inside our loop, we're going to need to eventually get to a point where I is no longer less than 40, so that whatever is happening inside this loop will stop. So let's take a look at how that will occur. What we're going to do in this script is we're going to draw some ball shapes, circle shapes, out onto the screen. So I'll make another local variable, call it color. And I'm going to set the color using another built-in function. Make color RGB, red, green, blue. And we're going to use this function to select a random color for each of the circles that we create. Make color RGB function takes 3 numbers, and these numbers are going to define the shade of the color in red, green, and blue channels. So we're randomly selecting numbers from each of those to come up with a random color for each of the circles that we're going to draw. So coming back, now we've set the color, so we're going to use another built-in function called draw set color. So this is to actually draw our color, or to set what it's going to be. So we give it the contents of this color variable. So this is the setting what a color will be, and this is saying we're going to draw using this color. And once we've got that set up, we can actually draw the circle. So we use another built-in GML function, draw circle. We're going to give the x and y coordinates for that circle. We're going to give the radius of that circle, and we're going to say whether or not we want to have an outline drawn around the circle. In our case, we're just going to say x and y, and then for the radius, we're going to say the current value of our I variable, which remember is going to, the idea is that we're going to set it up so that it keeps increasing one at a time, and we'll do that in just a minute. And we will put a border around our circle. Then finally, we need to make sure that the value of I in our script is going up each time we want it to go up by 1, each loop. So we're going to say I equals I plus 1. Now there are other ways to write this, but for now we'll write it this way. Okay, so while our I is less than 40, we're going to have a local variable called color. We'll fill that variable with a given color, and then we'll assign that color to what we're going to draw, and then what we're going to draw is a circle, and then we'll position that circle out onto the screen. Now wherever the object is that we attach this script to, it's going to be drawn there, and then we'll change the radius, making it bigger each time we draw our circle. Okay, now that we have our while loop set to draw our circle and to repeatedly draw a circle, we need to call this script from an object. Now, previously we've been using our controller object, but for the circle script we're not going to use it, and I'll explain why in a minute. We're going to create a new object. It's also not going to have a sprite attached to it, but we'll call it object underscore circles. And the event we're going to attach to this object is going to be a draw event. And then within that draw event, once again, we'll have a execute script action, and now we'll choose our circle script. The reason that we are placing the action here inside a draw event is simply because in our script we are drawing something. And in order for a draw function to work properly inside GameMaker, it needs to occur as a result of a draw event. Let me show you what that looks like. I'm coming out to my room, get rid of anything we've got out there, and I'm going to choose my circles objects, and I'll place a couple of them out onto the screen. Save what I've got, and we'll see now how this works when we get it into the game. Okay, you'll see I've got 3 objects here, here, and here, and so at that X and Y, it calls a function to draw the circle, and then it has a while loop, and then it's continuously drawing a new circle at a bigger size and a different random color. So this is the effect you get when that occurs. And since the whole thing is happening inside a draw event, it happens over and over and over again. There's another kind of loop I still want to talk about here. We've done a repeat loop, we've done a while loop, and there's another type called a for loop. You can see an example of it right here. The script that I've got here does basically the same thing we've got going over here, except it just lists it in a slightly different way. So here we say that while our variable is less than 40, or while some expression is true, do everything that's inside the loop. And with a while loop, you need to make sure that eventually this thing is no longer going to be true so that it will stop happening. A for loop is a somewhat safer way to accomplish the same thing. So instead of doing while, I would say for, and then here's where I would set the value of that I variable, so I can get rid of it here. And then I put a semicolon, and then I say I less than 40, which looks pretty familiar, and then I put in the incrementing of that variable right here. So in some ways it works almost exactly the same, right? We're just bundling up all of the important pieces of the loop right here. We're setting the initial value of our variable. We are setting the expression, the condition that we're looking to see whether it's true or not, and we're taking care of making sure eventually it's no longer going to be true right here by incrementing our variable. And we no longer need to increment the value of our I variable inside the loop, right? because we've already done it up here. So if we save that and run it, we can now see that it should work the same way. Right, here we are. We've got our little mini versions of the circles. I changed it a bit from last time so that it's not drawing quite so many of them. And you can see by doing that, by decreasing the number of increments within our for loop, and we get smaller looking objects out on the screen because we're not making quite as many of them, and they're not growing as much in size. I'll show you what that looks like. So here I'm only incrementing it, or only looping 10 times. I want to show you one more thing with a for loop, and that's the use of nested loops. Let me give you an example of what that means and what it can be used for. You can use a nested loop when you want to, for example, place copies or instances of objects laid out in rows and columns on your screen. So I'm going to create a new script. I'll call this obj underscore, or we'll call it just rows, although it's rows and columns. This time for a nested loop, I'm going to declare 2 local variables. Then I'll create my first loop. And with the nested loop, we'll set our variable to 0 or to whatever to start with, to its starting value. Then we set a conditional check, and we'll use 10 again. And then we're going to have our increment. I'm writing a shorthand version of the same thing. Now we're saying I plus equals 1, which is the same thing. Then once we get inside this outer loop, we'll write our inner loop. And we'll do the same exact thing now with the j variable. And let's say I'm going to only have 8. Here I'm going to use the instance create function. And I'm going to position my objects on screen, so I'm going to position them at 40 pixels times whatever the current value is of I on this given loop, and that will give the x coordinate for the specific instance of the object that we're creating on the current iteration of this loop. And we'll do something similar for the y coordinate, but now we'll take 40 times the current value of the j variable, and then let's tell it which object we want to show out on the screen. We're going to show the ball object. I'm going to close out all of these braces. If you have one to start with, you need to have one that matches to close things out. If you remember, our ball object had a couple of events associated with it. It had a create event, it had an event and a couple of actions. It had a create event, and then it had an action to change which sub-image was shown of our ball sprite at random. And it also had a move fixed event, and it would move the ball off in a random direction. So what I've done here to demonstrate the use of this rows and columns loop is for our ball object, I just deleted out the move fixed action and left in the change sprite action. Then going back to our object controller and our space event, under the execute script action, we just need to choose that script, which I called object rows. Go back into our room. I'm going to delete out our circle objects, and instead I'll add a controller object. So let's see how this works now. We should be able to draw our balls in a series of equally spaced or specifically spaced rows and columns when I press the space bar, and there they are. So here will just change to a different sub-image. These are being drawn on top of the previous images.